If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. Glad you could join me today. I'm doing a review of Cal Newport's most recent book. The book is titled Slow Productivity. And by way of introduction for Cal, he's very knowledgeable in this productivity knowledge workspace. And if you've listened to much of my podcast, you know that I pay a fair amount of attention to Cal and to what he's doing, because I think he's really, really bright and really focused on this idea of productivity. If you don't know who he is, you should take a look. He's written several books over his career, and he did a computer science Ph.D. at MIT. And I think he's now doing a tenure track job at Georgetown, and he's researching computer science. But his writing is not really about computer science. He does use lots of examples from his computer science research, but his writing is about knowledge work and productivity. And he's very thoughtful about that sort of stuff. So just about anything he's written is thought-provoking on that subject. Recently, he released a book called Slow Productivity. And what he does is thinking about how to be effective in knowledge work. And he uses his variety of knowledge work, which is a little bit distinct, and generalizes it and helps us all understand knowledge work productivity. He's also written a little bit of fairly controversial stuff. For example, he wrote a book titled A World Without Email, which is a primer for companies and organizations on how to get rid of email, at least internally. It's very interesting. He's got some ideas about why email can be bad, the downside of using email, and particularly as it relates to how we work. And a lot of it has to do with how work gets assigned and who can ask who to do what, and these different ideas. So we'll talk about his book, Slow Productivity, and I'll make some recommendations and give you some takeaways on this great title. Before we get into that, I want to let you know that I was able to do a guest spot on Greg Payne's Cool Grandpa podcast. Greg's a really entertaining guy, and he uses his podcast to envision and think about how grandpas can be engaged and proactive in guiding their relationships with grandkids, which is a productivity topic. If you're going to have a relationship with your grandkids, it should be a good one, and it should move in the direction of you achieving your goals. And he talks about that on the podcast. I'm not a grandpa at this point, but I've enjoyed his podcast. It's enlightening and engaging as I think about, well, presumably eventually I'll be a grandpa, and here's an approach that might be useful for me. On this podcast episode, I had a chance to discuss how cool grandpas can be even cooler if they have less stress about their work and their tasks, and thus more time to focus on relationships with the grandkids. It's also fun to tell a few stories on my own dad becoming a grandpa. So my episode with Greg has already dropped, and you can find it there on his podcast. It's the Cool Grandpa Podcast, and his name is Greg Payne with a Y, and it's available on your podcast service. And I'll drop links to that in the show notes, both to his podcast and to my episode. It was a lot of fun to do that, and I appreciate Greg offering me the opportunity to discuss doing busy right for grandpas. When we think about the book, Slow Productivity, first, what's the book about? Cal is beginning to take on the notion of what he calls pseudo productivity. And when he talks about pseudo productivity, what he means is that the visibility of somebody working has been taken as a proxy for their productivity. And he talks a lot about why this is true, what other options we might have. And this really strikes at the heart of the productivity of knowledge work. Because as I've said before, knowledge work looks a lot like daydreaming. And what's happened in the modern workplace in this argument over should we be in the office or out of the office, that argument highlights the notion that managers tend to want to observe people at a desk because there's very few metrics for the productivity of knowledge workers. Cal refers to this as pseudo productivity, and he talks about what a drain it is on the resources of the organization. In this book, as a counter to pseudo productivity, he tries to bring in the notion of slowness. And in my mind, he's attacking this idea of busyness. And in organizations, busyness and visibility are proxies for productivity. And I think in our own work, we've adopted this mindset as well. And we substitute busy for productive. I think being busy is good. As I've said many times before, I think human beings need to be busy. I do think there's a limit to the amount of busy that makes sense for any of us. And that's why I'm interested in helping people do busy right. So that's that notion of slowness, that notion of slowing down in order to be more productive is really what this book is about. In addition, we need to think about who the book is for. And this, I think, is really important in this particular case. At the end of chapter 2, Cal mentions in the text that this book targets, in particular, anyone who has a reasonable degree of autonomy in their job. And then in his conclusion, he readdresses this idea. And I think that's really important and something that needs to not just be glossed over. For me, this note is quite cautionary. And after reading the book, I'm really not sure that the prescriptive ideas that he gives should or could be applied in other areas. I think reading the book and automatically feeling like we have to apply his ideas is, at least in an organizational setting, fairly risky. And he brings this up 2 different times in the book. So if you are not in the core audience for this book, you've been warned. Otherwise, I think it's a great book, very thoughtful. Cal is always interesting, and there are constraints in his worldview, and he freely acknowledges that. He's very insightful on the challenges of modern knowledge work in organizations. So the book is for people who have this, he says, reasonable degree of autonomy. I would nuance that a little bit and say a great degree of autonomy. He makes suggestions such as slow down. He makes suggestions such as greatly increase your estimated project duration when asked so that you have time to do this. And I think that while that's great advice, if we do have this high level of autonomy, I think most of us really don't have that high a level of autonomy. So if you go and read the book, then I've let you know where I think we are on that, and assess your degree of autonomy before you take on what his advice actually is. That said, I love Cal. I love the work that he's doing, and he's very thoughtful in these areas. So, what am I looking for when I pick up this book? What am I trying to understand from Cal? So, the first thing is, why and how should we slow down? How would we go about slowing down, and why should we do it? Because it's quite counterintuitive, particularly relative to the culture. Even for me, and I combat this notion of over busy. I think busy for the sake of busy is bad, and Cal's brushing up against that notion here. But it is very counterintuitive, so I want to understand his justification for his title. And knowing him to be a thoughtful guy, I'm sure he's got one. So I'm just trying to understand where he's at in this particular book. Another thing I'm looking for in this book is Cal's notion of productivity. What does he mean when he says slow down to achieve greater productivity in knowledge work? I know that Cal is a scientist, and so ideally we would see some sort of an experiment or some sort of a test of a hypothesis. And we don't. And I think the reason is pretty obvious, which is we struggle to define what productivity is. When I say an experiment, what I mean is you take a group of people and you have them practice one set of things, and then you take another group of people and have them practice another set of things, and then you talk about the difference. And I would love to be able to do an experiment like that with attention compass. But like Cal, we really struggle with this notion of productivity in knowledge work. And so he doesn't do an experiment. I've never done an experiment. It's very, very difficult without some definition of an outcome that we'd be trying to measure. So it's not a necessarily critique of the book, but I would have loved for him to say, oh, here's my definition of knowledge work productivity. Failing that, then we go back and we look for definitional and theoretical support for his ideas, much like you do when you listen to this podcast. So, looking at the definitions that he proposes in his book, he does have a very clear definition of knowledge work, and I'll give that to you. So, Cal's definition of knowledge work is the economic activity in which knowledge is transformed into an artifact with market value through the application of cognitive effort. And I think that's a solid definition. If we can't define an output, then we want to clearly define the activity as an aid to defining what the output is. And one of the big takeaways from his definition is this notion of market value. Market value is an interesting idea because it really carries the connotation of proven in the market. So the value of an idea is proven in the market. And when we think about value, in my mind, invariably we talk about quality. So quality and value are highly related. And quality in knowledge work, so we say, well, we don't know what value is in knowledge work. Can we begin to assess quality in knowledge work? And so far, including my reading of Cal's book and my own research, quality continues to be this elusive notion. Ideally, in any business, we would target a level of quality. And that notion it continues to escape us. So we got to continue to work there and understand what quality means in knowledge work, because then that could easily be a component of value in knowledge work. And Cal brings up an interesting idea about quality as it relates to value. He talks about one of his what's the word I'm looking for? One of his precepts for slow productivity is to obsess over quality. If you're familiar at all with the podcast, then you've heard me say that obsessing over quality can be a challenge to our productivity. So this is something that made me sit up and take notice. Okay, Cal, obsess over quality. How and why should we do that? And he has great reasoning for obsessing over quality. I worry about that in terms of perfectionism. And again, you've heard me talk about perfectionism on this podcast, this fear-based perfectionism that keeps us from delivering. And the notion of quality of knowledge work is very challenging. In fact, while I was recording this, I had this 30-minute aside with myself that I'll have to put off as another podcast. But I do think as knowledge workers in organizations, we need to be very careful about the level of quality that we intend to produce. That's step one. And then to try to figure out how to produce that level of quality. That's step two. Because the market value, the market pays for a particular level of quality. And so if we have set a price, then we need to attain an appropriate level of quality for that price. And many businesses have made money on both ends of the quality spectrum. Many luxury brands trade on the notion that their product is of higher quality somehow than competing products. And then other competitors compete on the idea that their quality is a sufficient quality, but that their price is so much better that the exchange is well worth it in terms of the value of the product. So when we think about how these two ideas relate, then this notion of obsessing over quality, I think, could be a challenge for the day-to-day knowledge worker in organizations. I will say he talks about this notion of organizing knowledge work. Cal talks about, it's an aside in one of his sentences, we need to organize knowledge work. And I agree with that. And certainly that's what Attention Compass is in place for. It's so that you can have a tool that helps you organize your knowledge work. If that's something that's intriguing to you, you agree that your knowledge work needs to be better organized, then I think we can work on that through the Attention Compass. So I want to make sure you understand that that tool's out there. And certainly my hope is that this podcast helps us think about organizing knowledge work. So what's good about Cal's book? Well, it's very thoughtful, and in a certain area of activity, I think it's immensely applicable. I think if you're a solo practitioner, certainly this slow productivity has proven to be, if not the best way to do it, at least the most common way to do it when we talk about artists, people that record music, real, I guess what we formerly would have called creatives. They take the time that it needs to take in order to produce the level of quality that they want to produce. Now, these are people that are competing directly in the marketplace, and the marketplace for ideas is somewhat different. And this will show up in this other podcast that I hope to do soon. But for now, just take my word for it. Producing a #1 hit record for my generation was something that you invested an inordinate amount of time in. And that's because the difference between being the #1 best-selling album and the #2 best-selling album is huge in terms of sales and profitability. So I do think there's areas where obsessing over quality is a great idea. I think for the rest of us, we need to focus on efficiency, effectiveness, those kinds of ideas, and to measure our quality very well. So it's a great idea, I think, in the appropriate context. I was able to come up with a idea that I think applies more generally, and this is Cal talking about this, and really crystallizing this thought for us all. So he talks about, when he talks about slowing down, he also talks about taking on fewer projects at any one time. And you can imagine, I love this idea. He's not talking about multitasking directly, because multitasking is this in the moment. Multitasking is trying to do two things at once right now, in my definition. But he does talk about this number of projects in flight idea. And he says that in order to be slow productive, then practitioners need to take on very few projects at the same time. And as he's defending this idea, he mentions the notion of overhead tax. And I think it's a great concept for everybody that's involved in knowledge work or project work at all, for that matter. Overhead tax is the notion that a project in flight has an ongoing maintenance cost. And as a former, some would say reformed project manager, I've seen this cost in big projects and small projects. The cost is this overhead in the sense that it has to do with managing the project itself, and also, but sometimes perhaps secondarily, managing the output of the project. So this goes back to the idea. So when he says minimize the number of projects because you pay the overhead tax for each one, that gets back to this notion of switching cost among competing projects. And when he talks about obsessing over quality and he talks about slowing down, then a great way to do that would be to minimize the number of projects in flight at any one time. And he says, well, that also helps you minimize this overhead tax, because overhead tax has two components. And I'll try and break this out because I'm not sure that Cal did it, but just in a way to help. So a project in and of itself has some amount of overhead tax. And it's overhead tax because it's non-productive labor or effort or attention that does not produce the result that we're looking for in the project. And as I've said many times before, multiple projects in flight cause us to bear the cost of task switching. And that cost is higher relative to the level of work one's engaged in. Cal has said before, and I've said before, the quality of the problem you're trying to solve is an indication of the value of a solution, but it's also an indication of the difficulty of the task. And a very, very difficult task, when interrupted, the interruptions are more costly than in a simple task. And the practical examples abound. If you're sweeping the floor and you stop sweeping the floor in order to talk to your spouse, then that switching cost is actually very low because what you're doing is very, very simple. It's very little reloading. There's some, but very little. Where was I sweeping? Is now when I need the dustpan. And you can get back to that very quickly. And I think this is a core notion of multitasking. We learn to multitask from activities that have very low switching cost. And then we take that habit and apply it to tasks that have very high switching cost. And then we wonder why we can't be productive. So this variable switching cost, I think, is a notion that's important here. So in attention compass thinking, we talk about focus and how extending that focus over a period of time is very useful for the projects that actually produce value for us in our knowledge work. So the overhead tax. And I said the overhead tax applies to individual projects in relationship to how difficult they are. But it also, since any task in flight has some overhead tax, then the number that are in flight at any one time also relates to the total overhead tax. So there's two ways we can address this overhead tax problem. One is to decrease it by taking on a smaller number of projects at any one time. And two is by addressing the overhead tax of an individual project and trying to decrease it. And I think both ways are good as we're trying to minimize this overhead tax and thus increase our productivity. So I think Cal's notion of overhead tax is both components. So one of the components of overhead tax in knowledge work is this cost of task switching. And the other is the amount of overhead tax that is the minimum for any project that's in flight. So when we think about projects that are in flight, overhead tax is related to maintaining project or task status. So there's some component of our attention, some share of our attention that is trying to maintain, manage, and store project status. And in the example I gave of sweeping the floor, if you stop sweeping the floor, there's a little bit of your brain that's engaged in, okay, where did I stop? What part of the floor has been swept and what part of the floor hasn't? If your floor is pretty dirty, then it's pretty easy to see what part of it has been swept and what part hasn't. If your grass is really long, it's pretty easy to see where you stopped cutting it. But in other areas, it's not so easy to just immediately reassess project status. And so we keep it, some part of our brain is attached to project status at any time. And understanding and maintaining a view of projects, complex projects, is actually very hard. There's a big chunk of the practice of project management. And again, this is the Project Management Institute and certified project management. There's a huge effort, and it is an overhead effort, and everybody acknowledges that. There's a huge effort in maintaining the current status of the project, because one of the challenges of a project manager's existence is that there are many people who can pop up out of the clear blue nowhere and say, oh, by the way, how's X and Y coming? And as a project manager, not being able to answer that question is challenging. There's this notion of, well, if you're managing the project, you should know its status. Well, the status of a project in flight is a very complicated idea. So overhead tax then is related to this maintenance of task status. And it's really interesting, and I'll get into more of this later. It's really interesting how the complexity of a task is related to its status. Another component of overhead tax is, at least in the modern organization, related to team communications. So one of the things that's typically true about a project, as defined by the Project Management Institute, is that multiple people are involved, and there has to be some coordination of effort. You can't have the drywall guys come in on your remodeling project until the electricians are finished. and delay in between the electrician finishing and the drywall guy starting adds to the overall length of the project, which is typically considered to be bad. And so this team communication piece of, okay, what's the status? How are you doing? Do you need help? Let's get together and refocus. Let's get together and plan this work in the short term. Does everybody know what they need to be doing? These ideas. So there's overhead related to that. So that's another component of overhead tax. And all of these ideas then give us areas of research where we can work to minimize the overhead tax. For example, if your team has good communications and good group information management, then presumably the cost of team communications decreases, and thus that overhead tax decreases. So that's the idea, is then we can make progress against this overhead tax by researching team communications and group information management. And by making that more effective and efficient, and thus we lower a component of this overhead tax, thus lowering the total amount of overhead tax we're paying at any one point. And that's this inefficiency that we try to eliminate. So I talked a minute ago about this notion of overhead tax being related to the complexity of the project. And that's true. And the other point that I want to bring out, and this kind of goes back to Cal's notion of minimizing the number of projects in flight at any one time. A project or a task is at its most complex while it's in progress. And I've mentioned this before, but I'll just reiterate the logic a little bit here briefly. So a task that is not started is pretty simple. Have you cut the grass yet? No. And we can communicate quickly about that status. A task that's complete is quite simple as well, and maybe even simpler than a task that has not started. Is it done? Yes, it's done. And we all can communicate very quickly about that. In between those two states, the complexity of a task or project really increases in between those two states. While the project or task is in flight, it's very complex. And we can see this if we observe somebody doing work. Well, what does somebody doing work look like? Well, there's all kind of materials laid out. There's all kind of information on their computer screen. Their workspace is messy. And that is some proxy for the, and I'll tell you why I'm giggling in a minute. That's a proxy for the complexity of the task. And it's interesting how culturally we adopt this mindset a little bit because of the argument over a clean desk and a messy desk. The argument goes, it's not a formal argument, but the argument goes, if a cluttered desk is the sign of a cluttered mind, then what's an empty desk a sign of? And of course, the answer is, well, an empty desk is a sign of an empty mind. Well, I don't think that's exactly right, but it is, at some level, a valid cultural point. If you want people to perceive you as being busy, then it's real easy to equate, seeing lots of tools on your workbench as a proxy for you being busy. And I think, I'm being lighthearted about this, but I do think that this is how we relate busy to valuable in our world. And this is this cult of busyness that I think we're dealing with in the modern age. I think the logic is if you're busy, it's because a lot of people have claims on your time or want to have some of your time. And that's because a lot of people know you, and that's because a lot of people depend on you. And this is the way the logic goes. So we equate busy, even in our personal lives, we equate busy with delivering lots of value, which really is what makes Cal's premise for this book counterintuitive. So he says, well, slow down and be more productive. And culturally speaking, we take great pride in being busy. If somebody walked up to you and said, how you doing? And you go, well, I'm bored. One is they're probably not going to believe you. Two is if they're your boss, they're going to assign you some more work. And three is if it's somebody who can assign you work, then they're just going to think, well, you're not very valuable in them. And logically speaking, it could very easily be that the opposite is true. I'm not busy because I'm so valuable. I can make my living and a generous living in 4 hours a week, and the rest of the time I engage in my hobbies. You may go back to Tim Ferriss's book, The 4-Hour Work Week. And if you can make your living, whatever that standard is, in 4 hours a week, then why would you do any more work than that? But we do have this culture of busy, and that relates to how valuable we are. And that's this back to this visual of people that are very busy have lots of clutter around. And so it's easy to think of clutter as a proxy for busy. But it does hide the truth that an in-flight project is very complicated. A painter's studio is probably quite tidy until they're working on a painting. And then there's paints everywhere and brushes are dirty and right, drop cloths everywhere. And the same is true in knowledge work. You might be able to have some indication of how busy I am or the complexity of a project that I'm engaged in by looking at my computer screen and seeing how many different files are open and how often I'm referring to things on the internet and how often, research is a informationally messy idea. You're looking at a lot of the things and throwing them away or disregarding them or keeping some or whatever that looks like. And so, another analogy for this relationship of task complexity is, think about doing a jigsaw puzzle. Before you start it, all the pieces are in the box. Doesn't matter. Very simple. Now, the actual arrangement of pieces within the box is very complex, but they're all in the box. What are you worried about? We're chunking. And then after the puzzle's done, it's on the table and it has this pretty picture of something else and all the pieces are put together and it's still quite simple in the terms that we're talking about. In between times, depending on how you do your puzzle, you may have a pile of pieces over here and somebody says, well, what's that pile of pieces? You can go, well, that's the edge pieces. Another pile of pieces over here. And then they go, well, what's that pile? And you go, well, that's the pieces with white in them that are not edge pieces. And you may have 12 or 14 different piles along with some number of pieces that are yet to be sorted. And so in flight, this thing looks very, very complex. And I think that's true with projects. And this is just an illustration of the amount of overhead tax being related to the complexity of the project's situation. So if we want to lower our overall overhead tax, then we want fewer projects in flight at any one time. And this is in support of Cal's notion, really, of doing less at once. And it's really interesting to me, at least, and I hope to you, of how all these different things work together. And I'm a big believer in the notion of first, you minimize waste. If you're seeking efficiency, first you identify waste and minimize it. And I'll maybe get into that a little more later. But back to this components of overhead tax, right? Another notion of the component of overhead tax is this: while a project's in flight, there's this ongoing idea of where's the stuff. And this kind of goes back to the state of a project. Where's the stuff? I know I had that document that I needed to do this, but now it's gotten out of my visual range and I no longer know where that document is and I need it. So where's my stuff? And can we keep our workspace organized even in the throes of a project so that when we need to grab a specific tool, we don't have to hunt for it under a pile of other tools? So this notion of where's the stuff has to do with the overhead task of an individual project. And then the final component, I think, that I've been able to identify here is the overhead tax of picking up and putting down a project. Task switching cost is related to our ability to store the state of a project in flight. So that's how computers do it. So computers cannot actually multitask unless they are multi-threaded, which means they have multiple CPUs. And then the CPUs can be doing different tasks at the same time. A computer mimics task switching, multitasking by task switching, and it does it very rapidly. The hardest part in the technology of task switching, well, there's two. One is storing the state of the project because you don't want to have to start over. So if the computer is involved in some intensive calculation and you say, hey, you need to pause that and do this other thing, the computer has got to store the intermediate result of a process that's still underway. And it took very bright people a pretty long time to figure out how to do this. So one of the costs of task switching is storing the state, the intermediate state of whatever's been happening, of the process that's been going on. The other primary challenge is reloading that state very quickly, meaning that the way computers store and then retrieve those intermediate states is by making a copy of memory and storing it somewhere. And then when they finish the interruption, they go get that copy and put it back onto the CPU, like wham. And it's back to the state that it was in. And so when we look at task switching, we got to think about that in our own human brains. And can we do this? Well, it's one thing if you're task switching, and that's pretty controllable. It's another thing on a long-running project where you have to discontinue work for, say, because you need to go to sleep, right? Or you need to eat, okay? Computers can run on tasks for practically infinite periods of time, and humans can't do that. And so if it's because we're task switching, or if it's just because we're humans and we've run out of attention or we've run out of energy, there's the overhead tax of picking it up and putting it down. And this task switching is really the bigger view of this, because in one sense, task switching goes from working on your project, the task of working on your project, to the task of sleeping. But this notion of picking it up and putting it down relates to the cost of, I would say, having multiple projects going at the same time. So we've identified these components of the overhead tax, and each one of them should be attackable. And I would argue that we've attacked several of them with the attention compass process. An example of this idea is I coach people in a process that I refer to as parking downhill, which means that when you interrupt a task, you spend some time recording the state of the task. If you've listened to my podcast very much, this is akin to the notion of putting things back where they belong and putting them back in a good state. It's akin to putting your bookmark in your book. In other words, if you're reading and something interrupts you and you decide that you need to task switch, then you take the few seconds to put the bookmark in the book and set the book somewhere safe. We don't tend to just fling the book and immediately, unless the house is on fire, fling the book and immediately jump on putting the leash on the dog. And that's this notion of pausing well, parking downhill, trying to do a good job of recording the state of the ongoing task as we stop to do something else. And it could be as simple as highlighting a section of a document you were working on when it came time to stop working, up to as complex as trying to do the human analog, whatever it is, of dumping the contents of your CPU into a storage space. So this notion of parking downhill helps us reduce the overhead tax of picking up and putting down. And I think many times in our search for efficiency, we consider that to be a waste. Hey, I'll throw this over here. It'll be fine. I'll pick it back up when I get back to it. Well, the act of throwing it disorganizes. So I think, when we think about the overhead tax of picking up and putting down, I think there are ways that we can attack that component of overhead tax. Certainly one way is to avoid task switching when we can. And then the other way is to have a good process for recording the contents of the CPU when it's interrupted and called to do something else. So that's this notion of overhead tax. And as I've said before, overhead is easy to consider as a waste. Some overhead is necessary, and deciding what overhead is necessary and valuable versus what overhead is not necessary or valuable is one of the core challenges of managing work generally, but also particularly of managing knowledge work. And I'll go back and summarize these different components for you so that you can address perhaps each one of them, or one of them sticks out to you, you can address it in your own world. There was another really good idea, and this one's a little more practical, that came out of the book. Cal comes up with this practice for the challenge of managing time. And I think this talks about the notion of slowing down. He talks about instances where you're going to have to pay some overhead tax. For example, a status meeting on the project. And he uses the phrase, okay, one for you and one for me. And what he means is that each and every time you schedule an overhead task, you schedule an equal length of work for private work. And in this way, over time, what we'll wind up with is presumably at least a 50-50 balance between overhead work and, I'll say, productive work. And I thought that was really intriguing as an idea and something practical that we can put into place. Now, one for one may not be what you need in your world. It could be that your role is one where, if you're a manager, most of your time is going to be spent working on other people's problems and coordinating and dealing with this overhead tax. But thinking about the notion of, okay, every time I get called into a meeting, I'm going to schedule that time, and then I'm going to schedule an equal amount of time to continue my own private work. And then in future weeks, your calendar is full enough to where you can say, oh no, I really can't take that on right now. I can't attend that meeting because I'm fully booked today or this week or whatever it is. Can we reschedule? So I really like that notion. So going forward, you may want to think one for you and one for me. And I think this is something that's applicable even within organizations so that our calendar doesn't get overburdened by overhead tax. So that's kind of how these come together. So takeaways from the book. Work on your overhead tax. Okay. Again, and this is by way of some recap. We talked about overhead tax taking on two primary forms. One form is related to the number of projects underway at any one time. So each project has this kind of minimum amount of overhead tax that it carries. And the more projects you're working on at any one time, the more overhead tax in total you're paying. And the other is related to each project as it's underway. And I think there's also a challenge that we face of trying to reduce the overhead tax on projects that are underway. We talked about a couple of those ideas earlier. We talked about components of overhead tax. So we talked about task switching that includes the notion of starting and stopping. And we talked about becoming good at parking a task when you need to get interrupted. And the mental image there is this notion of a bookmark in a book. Take the 5 seconds to put the bookmark in the book. One of the things that I do when I'm starting a new book is I go get a bookmark and put it in the book. So I don't have to worry about whether or not it's efficient to use the bookmark. I have a stack of bookmarks. This may be interesting to you. My bookmarks are artifacts that I think are cool. For example, game tickets, inspirational quotes that I've put on pieces of paper. And these are the things that are my bookmarks. And so I have a collection of them, and they're conversation pieces if somebody wanted to look. And then while I'm reading a book, as I'm using my bookmark, maybe I see an inspirational quote, or I remember some past event that I enjoyed. That's free with your breakfast cereal in amongst this, but a little tip, right? Now, you won't want to use your Honus Wagner rookie card in mint condition as a bookmark, of course. But some of these things of intermediate value you can use as bookmarks. But I always put a bookmark in the book when I pick the book up to read it. And that way I don't have to go searching for a scrap. And I can stop my task well. I can manage an interruption well by having that bookmark at hand. And so that's just a mental image of this notion of parking downhill or this notion of stopping well. Components of the overhead tax. Task switching, status reporting, we talked about that. Maintaining the status of a project is costly. Team communication, if you're in a team, that's one of these components of overhead tax. The complexity of an in-progress task versus a task that's not started or a task that is completed is also a component of the overhead tax. Again, that's where attention compass works, is attacking these components of this overhead tax. So that's something you may want to consider as you listen to future episodes of the podcast. Again, just a warning, I will say that we want to probably avoid the idea of obsessing over quality, at least most of us. I think that obsessing over quality can lead to procrastination. And the notion is that any product actually has near zero value until it's delivered into the hands of the people that are going to use it. That's this notion that inventory is bad, and we know this in the physical product world. We want to go ahead and recoup the fixed costs that had been created when we've developed this product. And the same is true of knowledge work. And also that work in progress is bad. work in progress is a cost. It's collecting up cost, but not yet delivering value. So I do worry about that, and I don't want to bang the drum here too hard. But I would say let's avoid the notion of obsessing over quality in most cases. So overall takeaways, what about the book? I'll say if you are not familiar with Cal's work and you want to explore what he's doing, I would suggest other titles. Digital Minimalism is a good one, as is A World Without Email. Digital minimalism is more, I would say, actionable on an individual level. You can do digital minimalism without anybody's permission. A World Without Email is more oriented towards organizations. So if you're a manager and you're interested in exploring how your organization can be more effective, A World Without Email is probably a good title for you. If you're early in your career, then I would recommend Cal's title, So Good They Can't Ignore You, which takes on the notion of passion projects or passion careers. And I think that's a very good book for people in their early career that are still really trying to decide what it is that's going to be their career. Now, if you're a longtime Cal Newport reader, as I am, I think I've read everything he's published that didn't have to do with high school. This is a great extension of his larger purpose of understanding these challenges to organizational productivity, in particular in knowledge work productivity, even in solo spaces. So a high recommendation for the book, but understand what the book says, that the target audience for the actions prescribed in the book are for people with this, and I'll say very, very high degree of autonomy in their careers. The final takeaway is read Cal Newport stuff. And I would just say start in the right place for where you are. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.